The cattle baron's laughter echoed across the dusty town square of Amarillo as he pointed at the massive figure standing in chains before him. What he thought was the ultimate humiliation for Jeremiah Big Jack Morrison would become the foundation of the largest ranching empire in Texas history. But on that scorching August day in 1878, nobody could have predicted that a 300-pound Comanche woman named Standing Bear would transform a broken giant into a legend. The crowd had gathered to witness what they believed would be Morrison's final downfall. For 3 years, he'd been the thorn in cattle baron William Hancock's side, the one man who refused to sell his land, the stubborn fool who thought he could stand against progress and power. Now humiliated and defeated, Morrison was about to receive what Hancock considered the perfect punishment, a wife he never wanted, from a people he'd been taught to fear. What happened next would reshape the American frontier forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jeremiah Morrison stood 6 feet 8 inches in his bare feet, a mountain of a man whose shadow could block out the Texas sun. His hands were so large they could palm a man's head like a child's ball, and his voice, when he chose to use it, could boom across a valley and scatter cattle for miles. But on this particular morning, as he knelt in the dirt outside Hancock's mansion, those massive hands were shaking. The chains around his wrists were what humbled him. Big Jack had worn heavier iron during his time in the Confederate prison camps. It wasn't the jeering crowd of townspeople who'd once called him friend before Hancock's gold bought their loyalty. What broke something inside Jeremiah Morrison was the sight of his family's land deed burning in a barrel beside him, the flames consuming 4 generations of Morrison's sweat and sacrifice. "You should have taken my offer when it was generous," William Hancock said, his polished boots clicking against the wooden porch as he descended toward his defeated enemy. Hancock was everything Morrison wasn't: refined, educated, connected to Eastern money and political power. Where Morrison was raw frontier strength, Hancock was civilization's sharp edge, cutting through obstacles with legal documents and purchased loyalties. The destruction of the Morrison Ranch had been methodical, surgical in its precision. First came the bought judges who ruled against Morrison in every land dispute. Then the poisoned water holes that killed dozens of his cattle. The mysterious fires that consumed his winter feed supplies. The bank loans called in early when Eastern investors suddenly needed their money returned with interest that compounded daily. Morrison had fought each attack with the stubborn determination that had carried him through Gettysburg and Antietam. But Hancock wasn't waging war, he was conducting business. And in business, the man with more resources always won eventually. 3,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the Texas Panhandle, Hancock continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd acquired exactly what he wanted, at exactly the price he'd planned to pay. "Your grandfather cleared that land with his own hands, didn't he? Built the first cabin with timber he cut himself." Such a romantic story of frontier determination. Morrison's jaw worked, but no words emerged. His grandfather had been a giant too, though not quite as tall as his descendant. Old Henrik Morrison had arrived in Texas when it was still Mexico, when Comanche raids were a weekly terror and survival meant fighting for every acre, every head of cattle, every breath you took in a land that tried to kill you daily. "The thing about romance," Hancock said, examining his manicured fingernails, "is that it doesn't pay debts. Your family's been running that ranch on credit and stubbornness for decades." I simply called in the notes. The legal maneuvers had been brilliant in their complexity. Morrison had inherited not just land, but obligations debts his father had incurred during the lean years after the war, mortgages that had been sold and resold through a network of Eastern financiers until they ended up in Hancock's portfolio. When Hancock demanded immediate payment of the full amounts, Morrison had discovered that owning land meant nothing if you couldn't prove you owned it free and clear. "But I'm not a cruel man," Hancock continued, his tone suggesting he was about to demonstrate exactly the opposite. "You worked that land honestly, even if you couldn't afford to keep it. You deserve something for your efforts. Consider this. My final offer of employment." That's when she was brought forward. Standing Bear walked with her head high despite the chains that bound her wrists, her massive frame moving with a grace that seemed impossible for someone of her size. She stood nearly 6 feet tall herself, broad-shouldered and thick-waisted, but her proportions suggested strength rather than softness. Her black hair hung in 2 long braids, decorated with feathers and bone ornaments that clicked softly as she moved. Her face was a map of her people's history, high cheekbones that spoke to generations of survival on the harsh plains, dark eyes that had seen more violence than most soldiers, and a mouth set in a line that suggested she'd learned to expect cruelty but refused to be broken by it. Scars traced across her hands and forearms, the kind that came from handling horses, weapons, and the 1,000 daily dangers of frontier life. "Meet your new wife," Hancock announced, his voice carrying across the square so that everyone could hear. "Standing Bear of the Comanche. She killed 3 of my men during a raid last winter, but the army decided she'd be more useful alive than dead. Seems they think a domesticated Indian might serve as an example to her people about the benefits of civilization." The crowd's laughter was ugly, filled with the kind of cruelty that civilized people reserved for those they considered less than human. Morrison felt something twist in his chest as he watched Standing Bear's face remain impassive despite the humiliation being heaped upon her. "She comes with a dowry," Hancock continued, producing a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of silver coins. $50 and a claim to exactly 160 acres of land, the worst 160 acres in the territory. Alkali soil, no water, no grass. But it's yours, Morrison, along with your bride. My wedding gift to you both. Morrison understood the calculated cruelty of the offer. Hancock was giving him just enough to survive, but not enough to prosper. He'd be reduced to scratch farming on land that couldn't support a decent vegetable garden, married to a woman whose very presence would mark him as either a fool or a traitor in the eyes of every white settler in the territory. It was the perfect punishment for a man who'd refused to be bought, reduce him to something lower than a hired hand, something that existed only at Hancock's sufferance. But there was something in Standing Bear's eyes as she looked at Morrison that the cattle baron hadn't counted on. Not submission or resignation, but calculation. She was studying him the way a warrior studies an enemy, looking for weaknesses and strengths, evaluating threats and opportunities. When their eyes met across the dusty square, Morrison saw recognition pass between them. Not attraction that would come later, if it came at all, but the acknowledgement of 2 people who'd been marked for destruction by the same enemy. Standing Bear spoke for the first time since being brought forward, her English accented but clear. "This man is strong," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "Strong enough to work bad land into good land, smart enough to know his enemies, brave enough to fight when fighting is needed." The crowd stirred uneasily. This wasn't the broken savage they'd expected to witness being married off to a defeated giant. This was a woman who spoke with authority about strength and intelligence and courage. Hancock's smile flickered for just a moment. "Are you saying you approve of this arrangement?" Standing Bear's response was delivered with the kind of dignity that made everyone present suddenly aware of how petty their entertainment had become. "I am saying that weak men make enemies of the strong because they cannot understand strength. This man," she gestured toward Morrison, "has strength that goes beyond his body. You give him to me thinking it is punishment. Perhaps you do not understand what you give away." Morrison found his voice for the first time since the proceedings began. "I accept," he said, his words carrying across the square like thunder. "The land, the money, and the marriage. All of it. Hancock's carefully orchestrated humiliation was suddenly threatening to become something else entirely. What was supposed to be a public demonstration of his power over those who opposed him was transforming into something that felt more like a challenge being accepted by people who'd never learned to surrender. "Excellent," Hancock said, his voice regaining its confident tone. "The preacher will perform the ceremony immediately. I wouldn't want either of you to have second thoughts about this generous arrangement." The wedding that followed was unlike anything the frontier town had ever witnessed. Morrison and Standing Bear stood side by side before Reverend Matthews, two giants among the gathered crowd, neither of them showing any sign of the humiliation they were supposed to be experiencing when the preacher asked if they would honor and cherish each other. Their responses carried the weight of oaths being sworn between warriors rather than the desperate acquiescence of people with no other choices. "I will," Morrison said, his voice carrying a conviction that made several people in the crowd shift uncomfortably. "I will," Standing Bear replied, her eyes never leaving Morrison's face. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, neither of them moved to kiss. Instead, they clasped hands, her massive palm meeting his even larger one, and something passed between them that was visible to everyone present, but understood by no one. They were no longer two separate people being humiliated by William Hancock's power. They were something new, something that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. A partnership forged in shared adversity, tempered by mutual respect, and witnessed by people who'd expected to see degradation but had instead observed the birth of something potentially dangerous. As they walked away from the ceremony toward the wagon that would carry them to their new land, Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced since the war ended: hope. Not the desperate hope of a man with no other options, but the strategic hope of a soldier who'd identified an ally in enemy territory. Standing Bear walked beside him with the measured pace of someone who'd learned to conserve energy for when it would be needed most. She carried herself like a queen being escorted to a throne rather than a prisoner being led to exile. Behind them, William Hancock watched their departure with the satisfied expression of a man who'd solved a problem permanently. He'd removed Morrison from his list of obstacles and eliminated Standing Bear as a potential threat to his expansion plans. In his mind, he'd killed 2 birds with 1 stone, reducing both of them to insignificance while demonstrating his power to anyone else who might consider opposing his will. What Hancock didn't understand was that he'd just created something far more dangerous than either Morrison or Standing Bear had been individually. He'd given 2 people who'd lost everything a reason to build something together, and he'd provided them with just enough resources to make that building possible. The wagon rolled away from Amarillo carrying 2 giants toward land that everyone knew was worthless, pulling behind it the laughter and whispered comments of people who thought they'd witnessed the end of a story. They had no idea they'd just watched the beginning of a legend. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The land William Hancock had given them was even worse than Morrison had imagined. As their wagon crested the final hill before their new property, both giants stared in silence at what stretched before them: 160 acres of alkali flats that looked like the surface of the moon painted white with salt and disappointment. Not a single tree broke the horizon. No creek meandered through the property, no spring bubbled up from underground sources. The soil, when Morrison climbed down and grabbed a handful, crumbled between his fingers like ash, leaving behind a bitter taste of minerals that no plant could survive in for long. "Even the jackrabbits avoid this place," Standing Bear observed, her first word since they'd left Amarillo 3 hours earlier. She stepped down from the wagon with fluid grace, her moccasined feet silent against the hardpan earth. "My people have a name for land like this. We call it where the earth is angry." Morrison walked the perimeter of their property, his long strides eating up the distance while his experienced eye cataloged every disadvantage the land presented. The alkali content was so high that it formed crystalline deposits across the surface, creating a white crust that reflected the sun's heat like a mirror. No grass grew here, no sagebrush, even the hardy prickly pear cactus that thrived in the worst conditions had given up on this particular patch of Texas. "Water's the biggest problem," he said finally, more to himself than to Standing Bear. "Everything else can be fixed if you've got water." Standing Bear was conducting her own survey, but her attention focused on details Morrison had missed. She knelt and pressed her ear to the ground, listening with the patience of someone whose survival had always depended on reading signs that others couldn't see. She studied the subtle variations in the alkali deposits, noting where they were thicker or thinner, where the wind patterns had created small drifts against invisible obstacles. "There's water," she said eventually, pointing toward the northeastern corner of their property. "Deep, but it's there. The earth tells stories if you know how to listen." Morrison followed her gesture, seeing nothing but more of the same barren landscape. "What makes you think so?" Standing Bear rose and walked toward the area she'd indicated, her movements purposeful and confident. "See how the alkali is different here? Less thick, different color, and the ground sounds different when you listen close. Water moves underground, even here. It just moves deep." She was right. When Morrison pressed his own ear to the ground where she'd indicated, he could hear something, not the gurgle of an underground stream, but a subtle resonance that suggested space, movement, life flowing beneath the death above. 60 feet down, maybe 70. Standing Bear continued. "Hard digging, but not impossible for strong backs and sharp tools." Morrison straightened, studying his new wife with increased interest. In the 3 hours since their forced marriage, she'd proven herself more observant and knowledgeable about the land than most men who'd spent their entire lives farming. Her people had survived on the Great Plains for generations, reading signs that white settlers missed entirely. "You know well digging?" he asked. Standing Bear's smile was the first genuine warmth she'd shown since they'd met. "Comanche women know many things that might surprise you. We know how to find water where there is no water, how to grow food where nothing grows, how to make shelter from materials that seem useless." She gestured toward the wagon that held their meager possessions, $50 in silver coins, a few basic tools, 2 changes of clothes each, and enough food for maybe a week if they were careful. "We have little, but little can become much, if you understand how to use what the land offers." Morrison felt something he hadn't experienced in years: curiosity about another person's knowledge. During the war, he'd learned to value men who possessed skills he lacked, understanding that survival often depended on combining different types of expertise. Standing Bear clearly possessed knowledge that his frontier upbringing had never provided. "What do you see when you look at this place?" he asked. Standing Bear turned slowly, taking in the entire sweep of their property with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "I see hard work," she said finally. "I see years of labor that will break weak people. But I also see possibility." She pointed toward a slight depression in the land that Morrison had dismissed as just another irregularity in the terrain. "Catch basin for rainwater. Build walls here, line it with clay, and every storm becomes drinking water for cattle." Her finger traced an imaginary line across the property. "Wind breaks here and here. Plant trees that can tolerate alkali, and they'll protect whatever you grow behind them." She gestured toward the southern boundary. "Hancock's land ends there. His cattle need water too, and the nearest good water is 8 miles south. If we had water here, closer water, ... Morrison caught her meaning immediately. They'd pay to use it. "Everything Hancock has built depends on controlling resources other people need," Standing Bear said. Water, grass, transportation routes. He wins because he makes people come to him on his terms. But if someone else had resources he needed ... The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle he'd placed within easy reach, but Standing Bear touched his arm gently. Not enemies, she said quietly. Not yet. 3 riders crested the hill behind them, a woman and 2 children, traveling light and fast with the urgency of people fleeing something rather than approaching something. Morrison recognized the type immediately. Refugees from one of Hancock's acquisitions. Families who'd lost their land and were heading west with whatever they could carry. The woman was perhaps 35, work-worn and sun-weathered, with the kind of practical beauty that frontier life carved into those strong enough to survive it. The children were maybe 10 and 12, old enough to sit a horse properly, but young enough that their eyes still held the wide uncertainty of people whose world had been turned upside down. "Begging your pardon," the woman called as she approached, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who'd learned that strangers could be either salvation or disaster. "We're looking for the Morrison place. Heard tell there might be work available." Morrison exchanged glances with Standing Bear. They'd been married less than 4 hours, and owned land that couldn't support a family of prairie dogs, much less provide employment for anyone else. "I'm Morrison," he said carefully. "This is my wife, Standing Bear, but I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. We're not in a position to offer work to anyone." The woman's face fell, but she didn't turn to leave immediately. "Name's Martha Reynolds," she said. "These are my children, Samuel and Rebecca. We lost our place to the Hancock Consortium 3 weeks ago. Been riding ever since, looking for any kind of honest work." Standing Bear stepped forward, her imposing presence somehow managing to be both intimidating and reassuring. "You have skills beyond farming?" Martha Reynolds straightened in her saddle. "I can cook, so teach children their letters. Samuel here's good with horses and machinery. Rebecca's got a gift for healing nose herbs and such like her grandmother taught her." "And you're running from Hancock," Standing Bear observed. "Not running," Martha said firmly. "Leaving. There's a difference. We paid our debts fair and square, but his lawyers found ways to say we owed more than we had. Rather than work his land as tenants on property that used to be ours, we chose to find our fortune elsewhere." Morrison understood the distinction. The difference between retreat and strategic withdrawal was something any soldier learned quickly. These people hadn't been defeated. They'd been maneuvered out of a position they couldn't hold, and they'd chosen to find better ground rather than fight a battle they couldn't win. Standing Bear walked closer to the Reynolds family, studying them with the same attention she'd given to the land. "How much money do you have?" The question was direct enough to be rude by white standards, but Martha Reynolds seemed to understand that it was practical rather than intrusive. $27 and some change. Enough to get us to California if we're careful with it. "California's crowded," Standing Bear said. "Competition for every job, every piece of land. Prices high, opportunity scarce." She gestured toward their desolate property. "Here, there's space. Problems, but space to solve them in." Morrison began to understand what his wife was proposing. "You're suggesting they stay?" "I'm suggesting we make a bargain," Standing Bear replied. "They have money, skills, and strong backs. We have land and knowledge of how to make bad land productive. Together, we might build something none of us could build alone." Martha Reynolds looked around at the alkali flats with the experienced eye of someone who'd worked difficult land before. "This soil won't grow anything that I can see." "Not yet," Standing Bear agreed, "but soil can be changed. Alkali can be leached out with enough water and patience. Plants can be found that will grow here while the soil improves. Animals can be raised that don't need perfect grass." She turned to Morrison. "How long before Hancock realizes that giving us this land was a mistake?" Morrison considered the question seriously. Depends on how successful we are. If we just scratch out a bare living, he'll ignore us. If we start to prosper, then we'll need to be strong enough to protect what we build. Standing Bear finished. Strength comes from numbers as much as from individual capability. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Morrison had ever witnessed. Standing Bear and Martha Reynolds conducted it like two generals planning a campaign, with each woman clearly understanding that they were discussing more than just a business arrangement. They were talking about creating something that didn't exist yet, a community built around mutual support rather than individual competition. A place where people who'd been discarded by Hancock's empire could rebuild their lives while building something that might eventually challenge that empire's dominance. Equal partners, Standing Bear proposed. We pool resources, share labor, divide profits according to contribution. Everyone works, everyone benefits, everyone has a voice in decisions. And if Hancock comes calling? Martha asked. Standing Bear's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then he'll discover that removing settlers from their land is easier when they're isolated and afraid. It becomes much more difficult when they're organized and determined. The handshake that sealed their agreement was witnessed by 4 children, Samuel and Rebecca Reynolds, plus the 2 Morrison children who didn't exist yet, but whose future was being shaped by decisions made on alkali flats under the blazing Texas sun. As evening approached and they made camp on their worthless land, Morrison realized that his punishment marriage was becoming something William Hancock had never intended. The foundation of resistance to everything Hancock represented. Standing Bear built their fire with buffalo chips she'd collected during the day, her movements efficient and practiced. Martha Reynolds contributed fresh bread from her supplies, while the children gathered what little dry vegetation they could find to supplement their fuel. Around that first fire on land that everyone said was worthless, 5 people who'd been discarded by civilization began planning how to build something that civilization had never imagined. By the time the stars came out, they'd sketched the beginnings of an empire. The digging began at dawn on their 3rd day, guided by Standing Bear's certainty that water lay somewhere beneath 70 feet of alkali-soaked earth. Morrison's massive frame bent to the work with the methodical determination of a man who'd learned that impossible tasks became possible through relentless application of effort over time. But it was Martha Reynolds who suggested the innovation that would change everything. My late husband worked the copper mines in Colorado before we took to farming, she said, watching Morrison and young Samuel Reynolds take turns with the shovel in the narrow shaft they'd begun. They had ways of moving dirt that didn't break a man's back in the first week. She sketched her idea in the alkali dusta pulley system that would allow them to haul buckets of earth up from increasing depths without requiring someone to climb out of the hole every time. More importantly, she proposed a method for shoring up the walls as they dug deeper, preventing cave-ins that could bury a digger alive. Wood's scarce out here, Morrison observed, studying her drawings with the eye of someone who'd built plenty of structures with insufficient materials. But not impossible to get, Standing Bear said. She'd been ranging farther from their property each day, scouting the surrounding territory with the systematic thoroughness of someone mapping enemy country. Hancock's men clear-cut timber from creek bottoms to sell to the railroad. They leave behind pieces they consider too small or crooked for commercial use. Rebecca Reynolds, Martha's daughter, looked up from the arithmetic she'd been working in a ledger book her mother had salvaged from their old farm. Stealing? Standing Bear's expression was thoughtful rather than defensive. Taking what others have discarded. Different thing entirely. The distinction proved important over the following weeks as their small community developed its own moral code, a set of principles that balanced survival necessity against ethical behavior. They would take nothing that Hancock's people were actively using, but waste left behind was fair salvage. They would trade honest work for materials when possible, but they would not starve or fail for lack of resources that others had abandoned. The timber recovery operation revealed just how much wealth Hancock's empire generated and how much it wasted. His logging crews worked with the efficiency that came from having more resources than they could effectively use, cutting only the finest specimens and leaving behind quantities of perfectly usable wood. Morrison and Samuel Reynolds made their first salvage run on a moonless night, using Standing Bear's scouting reports to avoid Hancock's patrol routes. They returned before dawn with enough lumber to shore up their well shaft and build the pulley system Martha had designed. This is just the beginning, Morrison realized as they unloaded their haul. Hancock's operations are so large-scale that their waste could supply everything we need. Standing Bear nodded, but her expression carried a warning. For now. But waste that goes unclaimed for months becomes noticed when it starts disappearing regularly. We'll need other sources. The well deepened steadily as their techniques improved. 20 feet down, they encountered their first real challenge, a layer of hardpan so dense that their shovels barely scratched its surface. Morrison's brute strength could break through it, but the work was exhausting and slow. It was Rebecca Reynolds who provided the solution, demonstrating knowledge that surprised all the adults. Grandmother used to soften hardpan by building fires. On it, she said shyly. Heat makes it crack, then you can break it apart with tools. The technique worked perfectly. They would build a fire in the bottom of the shaft, let it burn for hours until the hardpan cracked from thermal expansion. Then clear away the ashes and break apart the weakened stone with picks and crowbars. 30 feet down, they struck their first encouraging sign: soil that retained moisture instead of repelling it. The earth they hauled up was still alkaline, but it felt different, held together better, showed traces of organic matter that suggested life had once existed at this depth. We're getting close, Standing Bear announced after examining a bucket of earth that came up darker and richer than anything they'd seen before. 40 feet down, the shaft began requiring careful engineering to prevent collapse. Morrison's mining experience from his youth proved invaluable as he designed a timber framework that could support the increasing weight of earth above, while providing a stable platform for deeper digging. But it was the discovery at 50 feet that changed their understanding of what they were attempting to build. The shovel struck something that wasn't stone, wasn't earth, but rang with the distinctive sound of metal against metal. Morrison and Samuel worked carefully to expose what they'd found, revealing a piece of rusted iron that extended beyond the boundaries of their shaft. "What is it?" Martha called down from the surface. Morrison studied the object in the flickering light of their oil lantern. Piece of machinery. Old, but not ancient. Maybe 20 years abandoned. Standing Bear descended into the shaft using the rope and pulley system they'd rigged for moving earth. Her examination of the buried metal was more thorough than Morrison's, her fingers tracing the shapes and trying to understand the object's original purpose. "Drill bit," she announced finally. "Someone tried to dig a well here before, got this deep and gave up." The implications were staggering. Their worthless land had been worked before by people who'd gotten tantalizingly close to success. The previous attempt had failed not because there was no water, but because the technology or resources hadn't been adequate to complete the job. Why did they stop? Samuel asked. Morrison studied the abandoned drill bit with the eye of someone who'd faced plenty of seemingly impossible challenges. Equipment broke, money ran out, or they lost faith. Happens all the time with projects this ambitious. Standing Bear climbed back to the surface, her expression thoughtful. Or someone made them stop. The possibility that Hancock or his predecessors had actively prevented the development of water resources on this land added a new dimension to their understanding of the forces they were confronting. If their property had water rights that predated Hancock's empire, those rights might represent more than just practical value. They could be legal weapons. Martha Reynolds, who'd been studying land records she'd salvaged from the courthouse. Before their old farm was seized, confirmed Standing Bear's suspicions. Original survey shows this property was claimed in 1851 by a man named Thomas Mitchell. Filed for water rights and mineral rights. Never proved up the claim, so it reverted to territorial control. What happened to Mitchell? Morrison asked. Martha's expression darkened. Killed in what the records call an Indian raid in 1853, but the timing's suspicious. He files for water rights, starts development work, then conveniently dies just before completing his claim. Standing Bear's laugh was bitter. Convenient for someone. My people raided widely in those years, but we didn't usually target isolated homesteaders who were improving water access. Water benefits everyone, even enemies. The historical pattern was becoming clear. This land had been kept undeveloped. Not because it was worthless, but because successful development would create competition for Hancock's empire. Someone had been working systematically to prevent anyone from proving that this alkali wasteland could be transformed into productive property, but the previous developers had failed where Morrison's group might succeed because they'd been working alone with limited resources against hidden opposition. Morrison, Standing Bear, and their growing alliance had advantages their predecessors had lacked: diverse skills, mutual support, and most importantly, knowledge of who their real enemy was. The digging resumed with new urgency. They were no longer just seeking water for their own survival. They were completing a project that had been sabotaged 25 years earlier, proving a claim that could establish legal rights, predating Hancock's control of the region. At 60 feet, they encountered another layer of hardpan. This one shot through with veins of white crystal that Martha identified as gypsum, a mineral that indicated underground water movement. At 65 feet, the earth they hauled up was noticeably damp, clinging to their tools with the consistency of potter's clay rather than the dry dust they'd been excavating for weeks. At 70 feet, Morrison's shovel hit something that wasn't stone or metal, but splashed. The cheer that went up from the surface when he called out, "Water!" could probably be heard for miles across the alkali flats. Martha Reynolds hugged her children while tears streamed down her face. Samuel Reynolds pumped his fist in the air like a boxer who just won a championship fight. But it was Standing Bear's reaction that Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. She simply nodded once, as if confirming something she'd known all along, then said quietly, "Now the real work begins." The water that filled the bottom of their shaft was clean, cold, and sweet, better quality than most of the wells serving Amarillo. More importantly, it rose quickly to a level that suggested a substantial underground source rather than just accumulated seepage. "How much do you think it'll produce?" Martha asked as they installed the pump mechanism Morrison had designed. Standing Bear was already calculating the implications. "Enough for our needs, plus cattle, plus whatever we can grow once we start leaching the alkali out of the soil. More importantly, enough to make Hancock take notice." Morrison tested the pump, watching clear water flow steadily from their well into the collection basin they'd built. After weeks of hauling every drop of water they used from sources miles away, the sight of unlimited fresh water on their own property felt like a miracle. But Standing Bear was right, the miracle was also a declaration of war. Word of their successful well would reach Hancock within days. Their worthless punishment land had just become valuable property, and William Hancock had built his empire by ensuring that valuable property ended up under his control. As they celebrated their first major victory around that evening's campfire, all 5 members of their small community understood that they'd crossed a line. They were no longer refugees scratching out a subsistence living on land nobody wanted. They were competitors, and competitors were something Hancock had never learned to tolerate. William Hancock arrived on their property exactly 1 week after. Word of the well reached Amarillo, but he didn't come alone, and he didn't come angry. Instead, he brought 3 witnesses, a surveyor, and his most charming smile, the same combination he'd used to legally steal dozens of properties from people who'd thought handshake agreements meant something in frontier Texas. Morrison spotted the dust cloud of their approach long before the riders came into view. 5 horses moving at a deliberate pace across the alkali flats, their timing calculated to arrive during the hottest part of the day when normal people would be seeking shade rather than conducting business. Hancock, standing there, said simply, not needing to look up from the leather traces she was mending. Her hands continued their work with steady precision, but Morrison noticed how she positioned herself within easy reach of the rifle they kept propped against their makeshift shelter. Martha Reynolds gathered her children instinctively, moving them toward the well where the newly built stone walls would provide cover if the conversation turned ugly. Samuel Reynolds, now 15 and growing into the kind of wiry strength that frontier life demanded, took up a position where he could see the approaching riders while appearing to be casually tending their small fire. The transformation in their little community was remarkable. In just 3 weeks, they'd evolved from a collection of desperate refugees into something that functioned like a military unit, coordinated, alert, ready for trouble without appearing threatening to casual observers. Hancock dismounted from his magnificent bay stallion with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent more money on his horse than most families earned in a year. His clothes were immaculate despite the dust and heat, his boots polished to a mirror shine that reflected the sun like signal beacons. Everything about his appearance was calculated to remind observers of the vast gulf between his resources and theirs. Morrison, Hancock called out with the booming friendliness of a politician greeting constituents. I hear congratulations are in order. Word in town is that you've accomplished something remarkable out here. Morrison straightened to his full height, his massive frame casting a shadow that fell across Hancock like a thundercloud. The cattle baron was a tall man himself, but standing next to Morrison made him look almost delicate. Mr. Hancock, Morrison replied, his voice carefully neutral. Wasn't expecting company. Oh, this isn't a social call, though I must say your wife has certainly made this place more civilized than I expected. Hancock's eyes found Standing Bear, studying her with the appraising gaze of a man evaluating livestock. I trust the marriage arrangement has proven satisfactory? Standing Bear rose from her work, her movements deliberate and fluid. At her full height, she was nearly as tall as Hancock himself, and her presence carried a weight that made the cattle barons' companions shift uncomfortably in their saddles. My husband and I are content with our arrangement, she said, her English carrying just enough formal precision to remind everyone present that she was choosing to speak their language rather than being limited to it. Excellent, excellent. Hancock's smile never wavered, but Morrison caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the cattle baron was reassessing the situation. I've brought along Mr. Patterson here, he gestured toward a thin man with surveyor's equipment, to verify some property boundaries. There seems to be some confusion about water rights in this area. The surveyor, Patterson, was already unpacking his instruments with the efficient movements of someone who'd performed this routine many times before. Morrison recognized the type of technical expert who'd learned to ask no questions about the political implications of his work. Confusion? Morrison asked. Well, you see, the thing about frontier property law is that it's remarkably complex. Hancock continued, his tone suggesting he was patiently explaining something simple to someone slow. Water rights, mineral rights, territorial jurisdiction, all quite complicated, easy for honest mistakes to occur. Martha Reynolds stepped forward, the land record she'd been researching tucked under her arm. According to territorial surveys filed in 1851, this property includes water rights that were properly claimed and documented. Hancock's expression didn't change, but Morrison noticed how quickly his attention shifted to Martha. And you are? Martha Reynolds, I've been researching property records for our legal filing. She unfolded a hand-copied map that showed the original survey boundaries. Thomas Mitchell filed a proper claim with the territorial authority, including water and mineral rights. When he died, the property reverted to territorial control with all rights intact. Ah, Mrs. Reynolds. Hancock's voice carried a subtle chill despite his continued smile. I believe we've met before. Your former property was adjacent to some land I acquired recently. The casual way he dismissed the forced sale of her family's farm as a simple acquisition made Morrison's hands clench involuntarily. But Standing Bear caught his eye and shook her head, slightly, a reminder that violence would play into Hancock's hands. Patterson finished setting up his surveying equipment and began taking measurements with the precise movements of someone following a predetermined script. Morrison realized that the surveyor wasn't actually checking boundary accuracy. He was creating documentation for whatever legal challenge Hancock had planned. The difficulty, Hancock continued, is that territorial water rights from the 1850s are often incomplete or improperly filed. The territorial authority wasn't terribly rigorous about documentation in those early years. Standing Bear stepped closer to the surveyor, studying his work with obvious interest. What boundaries are you measuring, Mr. Patterson? The surveyor looked uncomfortable being directly addressed. Standard property verification, ma'am. Making sure everything's properly documented. Documented for what purpose? Standing Bear's questions carried the persistence of someone who'd learned that important information was usually buried in details others preferred to ignore. Before Patterson could answer, Hancock intervened. Purely routine, I assure you. With new development happening in the area, the territorial authority wants to ensure all property claims are properly established. The third member of Hancock's party, a heavy-set man who'd been silently observing from horseback, finally spoke up. Name's Jenkins. I represent the Territorial Water Management Authority. Got reports of unauthorized well drilling in this district. Morrison felt his blood pressure rising. Unauthorized according to who? According to Territorial Statute 15-SC, which requires permits for all water extraction operations exceeding domestic use capacity. Jenkins replied, his tone suggesting he was reciting from memory. Wells capable of supporting commercial operations need territorial approval. The trap was becoming clear. Hancock couldn't simply steal their property using the same legal maneuvers he'd employed against the Reynolds family because they'd been careful to establish legitimate ownership. Instead, he was attempting to criminalize their success by claiming they'd violated regulations that probably didn't exist when they'd started digging. Standing Bear exchanged glances with Martha Reynolds, and Morrison saw understanding pass between the two women. They'd anticipated this kind of legal challenge and had prepared accordingly. Mr. Jenkins, Martha said formally, could you please cite the specific date when Statute 15A went into effect? Jenkins consulted a leather folder filled with official-looking documents. Territorial Statute 15A was enacted on, let me see here, August 15th, 1878. And when did we complete our well? Standing Bear asked Morrison. August 12th, 1878, Morrison replied. Catching on to their strategy. Martha Reynolds smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. According to the dates you've provided, Mr. Jenkins, our well was completed 3 days before the statute you're citing even existed. Retroactive application of territorial law is prohibited under the Territorial Constitution, Article 3. Section 7. The silence that followed was profound. Hancock's carefully orchestrated legal ambush had just collapsed because the women he'd dismissed as ignorant frontier wives had out-researched his own legal team. But Morrison knew that men like Hancock didn't abandon profitable schemes simply because their first approach failed. They adapted, found new angles, escalated their efforts until they achieved their objectives through legal means or otherwise. "Well," Hancock said finally, his smile becoming more forced, "there are other considerations, of course. Environmental, impact assessments, territorial development plans, coordination with existing water management systems." Standing Bear stepped forward, her imposing presence making even Hancock's horse sidestep nervously. "Mr. Hancock, you gave us this land as punishment because you believed it was worthless. Now that we've made it valuable through our own labor, you want to take it back using laws that didn't exist when we began our work." Her voice carried a quiet intensity that was more unsettling than shouting would have been. "My people have a word for men who behave this way. We call them promise breakers. It's not a good thing to be called among the Comanche." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Hancock had built his empire on the assumption that he could intimidate or outmaneuver isolated settlers. But Standing Bear represented something he'd never encountered, someone who'd grown up in a culture where personal honor was literally a matter of life and death. Now, Hancock said, his voice carrying the strained joviality of someone working hard to diffuse tension. "There's no need for anyone to get upset. I'm sure we can work out an arrangement that benefits everyone involved." "What kind of arrangement?" Morrison asked. "Well, clearly you've put considerable effort into developing this property. That work has value. I'd be willing to compensate you fairly for your improvements and help you relocate to land better suited to your circumstances." The offer was smoothly delivered, but Morrison could see the calculation behind it. Hancock was proposing to buy their improvements while keeping the land and its water rights, leaving them with money but no property to show for their weeks of backbreaking labor. Standing Bear's response was immediate and decisive. "We decline your generous offer, Mr. Hancock. Perhaps you'd like some time to consider." "No consideration necessary," Standing Bear interrupted. "This is our land, improved with our labor, protected by our legal rights. We will not be moved." Hancock's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold calculation that lay beneath his public charm. "Mrs. Morrison, I hope you understand that refusing reasonable offers often leads to complications. The frontier can be a dangerous place for people who don't have proper protection." The threat was barely veiled, but it was a mistake. Morrison had been prepared to negotiate, to find some compromise that would allow both parties to benefit from the situation. But threatening his wife transformed the conversation from business negotiation to personal confrontation. Morrison stepped forward, his massive frame casting Hancock into shadow. "Mr. Hancock, I believe you've said everything you came to say. Time for you and your people to leave our property." For a moment, the two men faced each other in silence. The cattle baron who'd built his empire through cunning and intimidation, and the giant who'd survived war and imprisonment and forced marriage to finally find something worth protecting. Hancock blinked first. "Of course," he said, remounting his horse with movements that were perhaps not quite as fluid as they'd been earlier. "Good day to you all. I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon." As the riders departed, kicking up dust clouds in their wake, Morrison realized that their small community had just crossed another threshold. They were no longer simply defending their right to exist. They were actively defying the most powerful man in the territory. The war Standing Bear had predicted was officially beginning. The first cattle arrived 3 days after Hancock's visit, driven not by enemies, but by a weathered Mexican vaquero named Carlos Mendoza, who'd been watching their operation from the hills for over a week. Morrison spotted him at dawn, silhouetted against the eastern horizon with the patience of a man who'd learned to evaluate situations thoroughly before committing to action. When Mendoza finally rode down to their camp, he brought with him 30 head of longhorn cattle and a proposition that would transform their small homestead into something much larger. "Senator Morrison," Mendoza said in heavily accented English, removing his battered hat with the formal courtesy that Mexican culture demanded even in business negotiations. "My name is Carlos Mendoza. I have been watching your operation here, and I believe we might be able to help each other." Standing Bear emerged from their shelter, studying the newcomer with the careful attention she gave to all strangers. Mendoza's reaction to seeing her was immediate and respectful, a slight bow that acknowledged her authority without any of the condescension most white men showed toward Indian women. "Señora," he said formally, "I have heard that you are a woman of great wisdom and strength. Your reputation travels far among people who understand the value of such qualities." Morrison was intrigued by the implication that Standing Bear's reputation had somehow spread beyond their immediate area. "What kind of help are you offering, Mr. Mendoza?" Mendoza gestured toward the cattle that grazed peacefully near their well, the animals clearly healthy and well cared for despite the harsh conditions. "I have been running cattle in this region for 15 years. Good cattle, strong bloodlines. But I have problems that your success here might solve." He explained his situation with the straightforward honesty of a man who'd learned that elaborate deceptions usually created more problems than they solved. Mendoza had been grazing his herds on open range that Hancock was systematically claiming, through legal maneuvers similar to those he'd used against the Reynolds family. "Hancock's lawyers say I need permits, licenses, fees for every head of cattle that drinks from streams that flow through his property," Mendoza continued. "But streams don't respect property lines, and cattle must drink water wherever they find it." Martha Reynolds, who'd been listening while preparing breakfast, looked up from her cooking. "How much is he demanding in fees?" "More than the cattle are worth," Mendoza replied simply. "He offers to buy my herd for half of market value, or I can pay fees that will bankrupt me within a year. Either way, he gets my cattle and eliminates competition." Standing Bear studied the longhorns with the expert eye of someone who'd grown up around livestock. These weren't the pampered stock that wealthy ranchers imported from back east, but the hardy, self-reliant animals that could survive and prosper in harsh frontier conditions. "What do you propose?" she asked. Mendoza's answer revealed the kind of strategic thinking that had kept him in business despite Hancock's pressure. "Your well produces more water than your small operation needs. My cattle need reliable water that Hancock cannot control through legal tricks. Perhaps we could arrange a partnership." The negotiation that followed was unlike the formal legal maneuvering they'd witnessed during Hancock's visit. Mendoza conducted business with the directness of someone whose word was literally his bond, while Standing Bear and Morrison responded with the practical problem-solving approach they'd developed during their weeks of building their homestead. 30. "Head to start," Mendoza proposed. "I provide the cattle, you provide water and grazing. We split profits from sales 50-50, with an option to expand the arrangement if it proves successful." Morrison walked among the cattle, noting their condition and breeding quality. These were animals that could thrive in alkali country if they had adequate water, and their hardy genetics would produce offspring well suited to frontier conditions. But it was Standing Bear who identified the strategic implications of Mendoza's proposal. "This partnership gives us more than cattle," she observed. "It gives us an ally who knows the local ranching business, connections to markets we couldn't access alone, and most importantly, protection." She was right. Mendoza's reputation in the Mexican ranching community would lend credibility to their operation, while his knowledge of cattle markets would help them avoid the kind of pricing manipulations that Hancock used to control smaller ranchers. More importantly, accepting Mexican partnership would send a clear message to Hancock that their operation wasn't limited to the outcasts and refugees he'd dismissed as insignificant. They were building something that crossed cultural boundaries and challenged his assumption that he could isolate them from broader support networks. The handshake that sealed their agreement was witnessed by Samuel Reynolds, who'd been studying the cattle with the intense interest of a young man discovering his calling. At 15, Samuel had already demonstrated remarkable skill with horses and machinery, but watching him interact with Mendoza's longhorns revealed a natural affinity for livestock management. "The boy has good instincts," Mendoza observed, watching Samuel gentle a skittish heifer with patient, confident movements. With proper training, he could become an excellent vaquero. A comment sparked an idea that would prove crucial to their expanding operation. Samuel Reynolds needed skills that his mother couldn't provide, while Mendoza needed trustworthy help that he could train in his own methods. An apprenticeship arrangement would benefit both parties, while strengthening the bonds between their allied operations. 6 months training with your operation, Martha Reynolds proposed after discussing the opportunity with her son. Samuel learns cattle management, you get reliable help, and we all learn whether this partnership has long-term potential. The agreement was struck immediately, with Samuel practically vibrating with excitement at the prospect of learning professional ranching skills. But it was Rebecca Reynolds who made the observation that would shape their next phase of expansion. "If Mr. Mendoza's cattle are here, and other ranchers are facing the same problems with Mr. Hancock's fees and legal tricks, wouldn't some of them be interested in similar arrangements?" The 12-year-old girl had identified the key to transforming their single-family homestead into something much larger, a network of partnerships that would allow multiple small operators to pool resources and share risks while maintaining independence from Hancock's empire. Standing Bear began mapping the possibilities immediately. How many ranchers in this region are facing pressure from Hancock's expansion? Mendoza's answer was both encouraging and sobering. Perhaps 20 families with small herds, maybe 5 larger operations that still maintain independence. All of them looking for alternatives to Hancock's terms, but most of them afraid to act alone. What if they weren't acting alone? Morrison asked. The concept they developed over the following days was revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of competing against each other for limited resources while Hancock picked them off individually, independent ranchers could form a cooperative alliance that shared water rights, grazing areas, and market access. Each member would contribute according to their capabilities, cattle, labor, expertise, or capital, while receiving benefits proportional to their investment. More importantly, the alliance would be large enough to negotiate directly with distant markets, eliminating their dependence on Hancock's distribution network. "It's been done before," Martha Reynolds said, consulting the historical records sheet. "Been researching. Cattlemen's associations in Kansas and Colorado have successfully challenged monopolistic practices by pooling resources and presenting unified resistance to unfair pricing." Standing Bear's contribution to the planning was characteristically practical and strategic. Alliance must be more than business arrangement. Must be community that supports members when they face individual pressure. Hancock wins by isolating his targets. We win by ensuring no one faces him alone. The recruitment process began immediately, with Mendoza serving as their initial contact with the broader ranching community. His reputation and cultural connections opened doors that would have remained closed to Morrison's group, while their demonstrated success with water development and land improvement provided concrete evidence that their proposals weren't simply desperate schemes. The first recruits were families facing immediate crisis, small operators who'd received ultimatums from Hancock's lawyers and had weeks, rather than months, to find alternatives. Their desperation made them willing to take risks that more established ranchers might avoid, but it also made them valuable allies who understood the stakes involved. Jose Ramirez brought 12 head of cattle and expertise in desert agriculture. That complemented Standing Bear's knowledge of alkali soil improvement. The Patterson family contributed a small herd and mechanical skills that proved invaluable for maintaining equipment and developing infrastructure. Most significantly, they were joined by Frank Donnelly, an Irish immigrant who'd brought advanced breeding techniques from County Cork and maintained detailed records of bloodline. development that would allow their alliance to improve stock quality systematically over time. Each new member brought not just resources, but skills and connections that expanded their collective capabilities. More importantly, each addition to their alliance reduced Hancock's ability to control their individual fate through legal or economic pressure. By the end of their first month as a cooperative, they were managing over 200 head of cattle on land that everyone had considered worthless. Their well was supporting not just livestock, but the beginning of agricultural operations that would prove alkali soil could be made productive through patient application of proper techniques. But it was the letter that arrived from the territorial capital that truly demonstrated how far they'd come from their desperate beginning. Territorial authorities, responding to reports of innovative land development and cooperative ranching techniques, requested permission to study their operation as a potential model for frontier development policy. Government surveyors wanted to document their methods, while territorial economists sought to understand how their alliance structure might be replicated in other regions. Standing Bear read the official correspondence aloud to their assembled partners, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose vision was being validated by external recognition. "They want to learn from us," she observed. "The same authorities who ignored us when we were struggling now seek our expertise because we've proven that cooperation can accomplish what individual effort cannot." Morrison felt a pride he hadn't experienced since his military service. The satisfaction of building something that mattered, something that would outlast any individual contribution. Their punishment land had become the foundation of an empire built not on conquest and exploitation, but on mutual support and shared prosperity. But even as they celebrated their growing success, all of them understood that their achievements had painted a target on their collective back. Hancock had dismissed them as insignificant when they were struggling to survive. Now they represented something he couldn't afford to ignore, proof that his empire could be challenged by people working together. The real test of their alliance was about to begin. The stranger who rode into their settlement on a chestnut mare, worth more than most men earned in a year, wasn't one of Hancock's agents, but he might as well have been. Everything about Douglas Macready screamed Eastern money and political connections, from his tailored riding clothes to the expensive surveying equipment packed in his saddlebags. Standing Bear spotted him first, her keen eyes picking out details that others might miss. "Railroad man," she said quietly to Morrison as they watched the newcomer approach their main camp. "See how he studies the land? Not looking at what's here now, but imagining what could be built." Macready dismounted with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to fine horses and formal occasions. His smile was professionally warm as he removed his hat, revealing prematurely gray hair that suggested a man who'd spent years making difficult decisions under pressure. "Good morning," he called out with the kind of practiced friendliness that politicians use during election season. "I'm looking for Mr. Jeremiah Morrison and Mrs. Standing Bear Morrison. I represent the Texas Pacific Railroad Company, and I believe we have business to discuss." Morrison emerged from the workshop where he'd been fabricating irrigation equipment, his massive frame and work-stained clothes presenting a sharp contrast to Macready's polished appearance. "I'm Morrison. This is my wife. What kind of business?" Macready's response revealed the kind of thoroughness that major corporations brought to strategic planning. He'd clearly researched their operation extensively, knowing details about their water rights, their alliance structure, and their growing reputation that hadn't been shared publicly. "The Texas Pacific is planning a new route through this region," Macready explained, unrolling detailed maps that showed proposed track alignments, station locations, and support infrastructure. "Our surveys indicate that your property sits at an ideal location for a major water stop and supply depot." The implications were staggering. Railroad development meant permanent infrastructure, regular freight service, direct access to distant markets, and most importantly, legal protection. that came with Federal Transportation Authority. Everything their alliance had been working toward could be accelerated dramatically through railroad partnership, but Standing Bear's expression remained skeptical as she studied Macready's maps. And Mr. Hancock? What does he think of these railroad plans? Macready's hesitation was brief but telling. Mr. Hancock has been consulted regarding regional development. The railroad, of course, works with all significant stakeholders to ensure smooth implementation of infrastructure projects. Martha Reynolds, who'd been listening while maintaining careful distance, stepped forward with the land record sheet. Been researching. Mr. Macready, these maps show the railroad crossing through several properties that Mr. Hancock acquired recently. Curious timing for those acquisitions. The railroad man's professional smile flickered slightly. Mrs. Reynolds, I believe? Yes, Mr. Hancock has been quite helpful in facilitating land acquisition for railroad purposes. A public-spirited citizen who understands the importance of progress. Morrison felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing a trap being prepared. With careful precision. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Macready? The Texas Pacific would like to purchase water rights and establish a permanent depot facility here. Macready replied, his tone suggesting he was offering a tremendous opportunity. Rather than making a business demand, we're prepared to pay handsomely for the necessary easements and facilities. Standing Bear walked closer to the maps, her finger tracing the proposed route with the attention of someone who'd learned to read between the lines of official documents. This depot would require how much land? Approximately 40 acres for the main facility, plus additional easements for track, water access, and expansion capability, Macready answered readily. Standard railroad development requires substantial infrastructure to support long-term operations. Carlos Mendoza, who'd been working with their cattle nearby, approached the group with the cautious movement of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of official proposals. Senator Macready, this railroad route, it goes through grazing land that many families depend on for their livestock. Progress requires adaptation, Mr. Mendoza, Macready replied, his tone carrying the patient condescension of someone explaining inevitable change to people too simple to understand it. The railroad will bring opportunities that far exceed the value of current land use. But it was Rebecca Reynolds who asked the question that exposed the real nature of Macready's proposal. Mr. Macready, if the railroad needs our land for depot facilities, what happens to our cattle operation and our alliance? Macready's answer revealed the coordinated nature of the pressure they were facing. Well, naturally, large-scale railroad operations aren't compatible with small-scale agricultural activities. The Texas Pacific would facilitate relocation to more suitable properties for those operations. Morrison understood immediately. The railroad proposal was another version of Hancock's buyout schemes, dressed up with federal authority and claims of progress. They would be forced to sell their improved property for depot construction, then relocated to inferior land where their alliance would struggle to maintain viability. And if we decline your generous offer? Standing Bear asked. Macready's response carried the unmistakable tone of someone delivering ultimatum disguised as information. Federal railroad development operates under eminent domain authority. Mrs. Morrison, the Texas Pacific has the legal right to acquire necessary properties for transportation infrastructure, with or without owner cooperation. The silence that followed was charged with the kind of tension that preceded either surrender or open conflict. Macready had just announced that their choice was between voluntary cooperation and forced seizure, while presenting it as a business negotiation. But Frank Donnelly, the Irish immigrant who joined their alliance with advanced breeding techniques, stepped forward with information that changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Mr. Macready, Donnelly said in his distinctive Cork accent, I've been corresponding with railroad development officials in Colorado and Kansas regarding cattle shipping infrastructure. Curious thing, none of them mentioned any Texas Pacific route through this region. Macready's professional composure cracked slightly. Railroad planning involves multiple alternatives, Mr. Donnelly. Not all proposed routes are announced publicly during preliminary phases. Donnelly smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd spent years dealing with elaborate deceptions. Aye, that's true enough. But the curious thing is, I've been told that Texas Pacific's actual planned route runs 30 miles south of here, through land that ... Well, through land that Mr. Hancock controls completely. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Macready wasn't representing legitimate railroad development. He was part of an elaborate scheme to force them off their property using false claims of federal authority. The real rail route would benefit Hancock's holdings while eliminating their competitive alliance. Standing Bear's response was immediate and devastating. Mr. Macready, you are not a railroad man. You are a liar working for William Hancock, using false claims about federal authority to steal our land. Macready's mask dropped completely, revealing the calculating businessman beneath the friendly exterior. Mrs. Morrison, I'd be very careful about making accusations you cannot prove. The Texas Pacific Railroad Company is a legitimate federal contractor with full authority to acquire necessary properties. Martha Reynolds pulled out additional documents she'd been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Mr. Macready, I have here copies of actual federal rail development plans filed with the territorial authority. The Texas Pacific route you're describing doesn't exist in any official documentation. The trap they'd laid was springing perfectly. While Macready had been researching their operation to find weaknesses, they'd been researching his claims to verify their legitimacy. His fraudulent railroad proposal was about to become evidence of criminal conspiracy. But Macready had one more card to play. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you misunderstand the situation. Whether or not you choose to cooperate with railroad development, this region is scheduled for significant changes. Federal authorities have identified various irregularities in local land management that require investigation. Morrison felt his blood pressure rising as he recognized another layer of Hancock's strategy. If legal trickery and false railroad claims failed, they would face federal investigation based on manufactured evidence of improper land use or water rights violations. What kind of irregularities? He asked. Macready's smile returned, carrying the cruel satisfaction of someone about to deliver a killing blow. Questions about the legitimacy of certain alliance structures, concerns about proper documentation of water rights, reports of unsafe livestock management practices. Federal authorities take such matters very seriously. The threat was comprehensive and sophisticated. Hancock wasn't just attacking their property rights. He was preparing to criminalize their entire operation through federal investigation, based on planted evidence and purchase testimony. But Standing Bear had been preparing for exactly this escalation. From their shelter, she retrieved a leather portfolio that contained documentation they'd been assembling for weeks. Mr. Macready, she said formally, I have here signed statements from territorial authorities confirming the legitimacy of our alliance structure, official verification of our water rights, and documented approval of our livestock management. Practices from territorial agricultural inspectors. She opened the portfolio to reveal page after page of official stamps, signatures, and seals that represented genuine governmental approval rather than manufactured challenges. More importantly, she continued, I have correspondence from federal rail development authorities confirming that the Texas Pacific route you described does not exist in any authorized planning documents. Macready stared at the documentation with the expression of someone whose carefully planned strategy had just collapsed completely. They hadn't just defended against his attack, they'd prepared comprehensive evidence that would expose the entire conspiracy. Morrison stepped forward, his massive presence making Macready's horse sidestep nervously. Mr. Macready, I believe it's time for you to leave our property. And when you report back to Mr. Hancock, you can tell him that his next scheme better be more creative than this one. Macready remounted his expensive mare with movements that weren't quite as smooth as they'd been upon arrival. This conversation isn't over, Morrison. There are larger forces at work here than you understand. Maybe, Standing Bear replied. But those larger forces will have to deal with us directly instead of hiding behind lies and purchased officials. As Macready rode away, kicking up dust clouds that seemed smaller and less impressive than when he'd arrived, Morrison realized that their small alliance had just survived its most sophisticated attack yet, but they'd also learned something crucial about their enemy. Hancock wasn't just trying to eliminate competition, he was systematically working to control all development in the region through corruption of federal authority and manipulation of legal processes. Their fight wasn't just about protecting their property anymore. It had become about exposing corruption that threatened every independent operator in the territory. The empire they were building would have to be strong enough to challenge not just Hancock's economic power, but the network of purchased officials and false documentation that protected his criminal activities. Standing Bear gathered their allies that evening to share what they'd learned and plan their next phase of development. The railroad man's visit had revealed the scope of what they were fighting, but it had also confirmed that their careful preparation and documentation could defeat even sophisticated attacks. "We're no longer just defending ourselves," she announced to the assembled families. "We're building something that challenges the entire system of corruption that allows men like Hancock to steal from honest people." The empire they were creating would be built on truth, cooperation, and legal authority rather than lies, intimidation, and purchased power. But first, they had to survive long enough to complete it. The attack came on a moonless night in late September, 3 weeks after Macready's failed railroad scheme. But these weren't the clumsy hired thugs that desperate men usually employed when legal methods failed. These were professionals who moved through the darkness with military precision, their faces blackened with charcoal and their weapons wrapped to prevent telltale reflections. Standing Bear woke Morrison with a touch so gentle it might have been mistaken for accident, but her eyes held the alert intensity of someone who detected danger through senses honed by generations of survival on hostile frontiers. She pointed toward the eastern ridge where their cattle grazed, then held up 4 fingers, followed by 2 more. 6 riders, approaching through terrain that would hide their movement until they were close enough to strike with devastating effectiveness. Morrison felt the familiar calm that had carried him through the war, not the absence of fear, but the transformation of fear into focused energy that sharpened every sense and steadied every movement. Their settlement had evolved considerably since the early days of desperate survival. What had begun as a single shelter near their well had grown into a cluster of buildings that housed the Alliance families, with carefully planned defensive positions that could provide protection while appearing innocuous to casual observers. Morrison moved through their compound with practiced silence, alerting each family to the approaching threat. Carlos Mendoza emerged from his quarters already armed and ready, his cavalry experience evident in the way he positioned himself to cover multiple approaches. Martha Reynolds gathered her children into the reinforced root cellar they'd constructed for exactly this kind of emergency, but it was Frank Donnelly who provided the tactical innovation that would determine the outcome of the night's events. The Irish immigrant had been experimenting with improved communication methods between their scattered facilities, and his system of reflecting mirrors could send coded signals across distances that would normally require shouting. "I can coordinate with our outer positions," Donnelly whispered as Morrison briefed him on the situation. "Jose Ramirez and his boys are watching the southern approach, and the Patterson family has good sight lines from their position near the equipment shed." Standing Bear was already implementing her own preparations, which involved techniques that white military thinking had never considered. She disappeared into the darkness with movements so fluid she seemed to simply fade from existence. becoming part of the landscape in ways that would confuse and unnerve attackers who expected to face conventional defensive tactics. The first sign that their enemies had underestimated their preparedness came when Ramirez's mirror signal flashed a warning that the attacking force was larger than initially observed. Not 6 riders, but 12, moving in coordinated teams that suggested they'd studied the settlement's layout extensively before launching their assault. Morrison positioned himself where he could command the central area while maintaining cover behind the stone walls they'd built around their well. The defensive position provided protection while allowing him to coordinate responses to attacks from multiple directions. The attackers' first mistake was assuming that their careful approach had gone undetected. They moved with confident precision toward positions they'd clearly scouted during daylight hours, expecting to achieve complete surprise against people they assumed were unprepared frontier settlers. Instead, they walked into a defensive network that had been designed by people with extensive military experience and refined through months of careful planning. Every approach route was covered by hidden positions. Every potential avenue of retreat was monitored, and most importantly, every attacker was being tracked by defenders who knew the terrain better than their own livestock. The battle began with a signal that none of the attackers understood. Standing Bear's voice rose from the darkness in a Comanche war cry that chilled the blood of men who'd grown up hearing stories about the terror such sounds represented. But this wasn't just psychological warfare, it was tactical coordination. The cry told every defender that the time for concealment had ended and the time for action had begun. Morrison's first shot was aimed not to kill, but to create maximum confusion among attackers who'd expected to control the pace and direction of the conflict. His target was the lead rider's horse, sending both mount and man crashing to the ground with a fall that scattered the carefully planned assault formation. Carlos Mendoza opened fire from a position that allowed him to catch 2 more attackers in a crossfire that forced them to seek cover in terrain that offered protection from his position but exposed them to other defenders. His military experience showed in the way he coordinated his shooting with the natural rhythm of the battle rather than wasting ammunition on ineffective suppressing fire. But it was Standing Bear who provided the tactical surprise that transformed defense into victory. She'd circled behind the attacking force during their approach, positioning herself where she could strike from the direction they'd assumed was secure. Her attack wasn't designed to inflict casualties, but to create panic among men who suddenly realized they were surrounded by enemies they couldn't see or predict. The psychological impact was devastating. Professional killers who'd expected to terrorize isolated settlers instead found themselves fighting opponents who possessed superior knowledge of the terrain, better defensive positions, and most importantly, the kind of coordinated tactical thinking that came from genuine military experience. Frank Donnelly's mirror communication system allowed the defenders to coordinate their fire with precision that seemed almost supernatural to attackers who'd never encountered such organized resistance from civilian targets. Every time the assault force tried to regroup or coordinate a new approach, they discovered that their movements were being anticipated and countered by defenders who seemed to know their intentions before they'd fully formed them. The turning point came when Jose Ramirez managed to capture one of the attackers who'd been separated from his companions during Standing Bear's flanking maneuver. Under interrogation that involved more psychological pressure than physical violence, the captured man revealed information that transformed their understanding of what they were facing. "Hancock didn't hire us directly," the man admitted, his voice shaking with the fear of someone who'd expected easy victory and found himself trapped by superior tactics. Word came through lawyers in Austin. $500 per man to eliminate what they called obstacles to legitimate development. Martha Reynolds, who'd emerged from the root cellar once the immediate danger had passed, studied the captured attacker with the calculating gaze of someone who'd learned to extract maximum information from minimal sources. "Who arranged the contract?" "Don't know names," the man replied. "Everything went through intermediaries. Legal firms, business associates, professional distance from the actual work." Morrison felt anger building as he understood the sophisticated nature of what they'd survived. This wasn't random violence or even simple intimidation. It was professionally planned assassination disguised as business necessity, arranged through legal structures that would protect the people who'd ordered it while leaving the actual killers vulnerable to prosecution. Standing Bear's questioning revealed even more disturbing information. How many teams were hired for this operation? The prisoner's answer chilled everyone present. 3 teams. "We were supposed to hit your main settlement. Other teams were targeting families at their individual properties. Make it look like random raids by hostile Indians." The scope of the planned massacre was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Hancock had arranged for the systematic elimination of every family in their alliance, with the attacks designed to appear like Indian raids that would justify federal intervention and military occupation of the entire region. Carlos Mendoza immediately organized rescue parties to check on alliance families who might be facing similar attacks at their home properties. The mirror communication system that had proven so effective during the battle was quickly adapted to coordinate searches across their expanded territory. But it was Rebecca Reynolds who made the observation that would shape their response to this escalation of violence. If they were trying to make it look like Indian raids, someone must be prepared to discover evidence that proves Indians were responsible. The 12-year-old girl had identified the final element of Hancock's strategy. The attacks weren't just meant to eliminate their alliance. They were designed to justify federal military intervention that would allow Hancock to claim their lands as abandoned property, requiring protective occupation. Standing Bear's face hardened as she understood the full implications of what they'd uncovered. "They planned to use my people's reputation for violence to justify stealing your land, then probably organize punitive expeditions against Comanche bands who had nothing to do with these attacks." The captured attacker confirmed her analysis with information that revealed the breadth of the conspiracy. "We were told to leave behind Comanche arrows, war paint, anything that would point to Indian raiders. Make it look convincing enough for federal investigators." Morrison felt a rage building that was different from anything he'd experienced during the war. Military combat involved killing men who were trying to kill you, but this was something more evil: the deliberate murder of innocent families to serve political and economic goals, combined with manipulation designed to trigger genocidal retaliation against people who'd done nothing wrong. How many other operations has Hancock arranged using these methods? Standing Bear asked. The prisoner's answer revealed that their alliance had been targeted as part of a systematic campaign that had been operating for years. Lots of them. Frontier justice, they called it. Remove obstacles to progress. Make examples that discourage other troublemakers. Martha Reynolds was already organizing the documentation that would be needed to expose the entire conspiracy. "We need names, dates, other targets. Evidence that can be presented to federal authorities who aren't part of Hancock's network." But Frank Donnelly raised the question that would determine their next phase of development. And how do we know which federal authorities can be trusted? If Hancock can arrange professional assassination through legal intermediaries, his corruption probably reaches higher than we've suspected. The night's events had revealed that they weren't just fighting a local cattle baron with political connections. They were confronting an organized criminal enterprise that operated through legitimate business structures and had infiltrated federal law enforcement to protect its operations. Standing Bear gathered their alliance families the next morning to share what they'd learned and plan their response to this escalated threat. The defensive victory had proven they could protect themselves against direct attack, but it had also revealed the scope of the conspiracy they were challenging. "We can no longer think of ourselves as ranchers defending our property," she announced to the assembled families. We are witnesses to systematic criminal activity that threatens every independent settler in the territory. Our choice is to hide and hope we're ignored, or to expose the entire conspiracy and destroy it completely. Morrison looked around at the families who joined their alliance, seeking nothing more than honest opportunity to build better lives. Children who'd learned to handle weapons because childhood innocence was a luxury their situation couldn't afford. Women who'd developed tactical thinking because survival required skills that civilization had never taught them. They'd been transformed by necessity from refugees into something much more dangerous, a community that possessed both the evidence and the capability to challenge corruption that had operated with impunity for years. The empire they were building would have to be strong enough not just to defend itself, but to bring justice to those who'd made justice impossible for others. That their punishment land had become the foundation for something. Hancock had never imagined organized resistance that could expose and destroy the entire system of corruption that had made his empire possible. The war was entering its final phase, and for the first time, Morrison believed they could actually win it. The federal marshal who arrived 6 weeks after the night attack rode alone, carried authentic credentials, and most surprisingly, came at their invitation rather than as another of Hancock's manufactured legal challenges. Marshal James Thornton was everything the previous official visitors had pretended to be, a genuine federal lawman with the authority and integrity to investigate territorial corruption. Standing Bear had spent weeks researching federal law enforcement personnel before making contact, using the network of territorial records and legal documents that Martha Reynolds had assembled. Thornton's reputation for prosecuting corruption cases and his documented conflicts with territorial authorities who'd been compromised by criminal interests made him the perfect ally for their escalating war against Hancock's empire. Mrs. Morrison, Thornton said formally as he dismounted from his sturdy government horse, I received your correspondence regarding organized criminal activity operating under cover of legitimate business enterprises. I must say, the evidence you've provided is both compelling and disturbing. Morrison studied the federal marshal with the careful attention he'd learned to apply to anyone claiming official authority. Thornton was perhaps 50 years old, weathered by frontier service, but carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone who'd never been bought or intimidated. His equipment was well maintained, but not expensive, suggesting a man who valued function over appearance. More importantly, Thornton had come prepared for serious investigation rather than superficial inspection. His saddlebags contained surveying equipment, legal documents, and recording materials that indicated he intended to conduct thorough examination of their claims, rather than dismissing them with bureaucratic courtesy. Marshal Thornton, Standing Bear replied, we appreciate your willingness to investigate matters that local authorities have chosen to ignore. The evidence we've gathered suggests that territorial law enforcement has been compromised by the same criminal organization we're reporting. Martha Reynolds approached with the comprehensive documentation they'd assembled over months of careful research. Multiple leather portfolios contained signed statements, official records, physical evidence, and most importantly, the testimony of the captured attacker who'd revealed the scope of Hancock's assassination operations. This is quite extensive, Thornton observed as he examined the organized evidence. How long have you been documenting these activities? Since we first realized that what we thought were isolated attacks were actually part of a systematic campaign. Morrison replied, every legal challenge, every false official, every assassination attempt, we've documented everything. Thornton's examination of their evidence was thorough and professional, revealing the kind of investigative experience that had made him effective at prosecuting complex criminal enterprises. He cross-referenced dates and locations, verified official signatures against federal records he carried, and most importantly, identified patterns that connected seemingly unrelated events into a coherent criminal conspiracy. The scope of this Organization is remarkable, he said finally. What you've documented here represents one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises I've encountered in 20 years of federal law enforcement. Carlos Mendoza, who'd been observing the marshal's investigation with the caution of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of official authority, stepped forward with information that would prove crucial to Thornton's understanding of their situation. Center Marshal, Mendoza said formally, the criminal activities extend beyond this territory. I have family in New Mexico and Colorado who report similar patterns of land seizure, false legal challenges, and violence against those who resist. Thornton's expression sharpened with the intensity of someone recognizing that a local problem was actually part of something much larger. Can you provide specific examples? Mendoza's answer revealed that Hancock's empire was just one component of a network that operated across multiple territories, using identical methods to eliminate independent settlers and concentrate land ownership in the hands of corrupt business combines. My cousin in Santa Fe reports forced sales using manufactured debt obligations. My brother in Denver describes railroad schemes identical to what you experienced here. Always the same pattern: legal pressure, followed by violence if resistance continues. Frank Donnelly contributed additional evidence that demonstrated the interstate nature of the criminal conspiracy. His correspondence with cattle ranchers in Kansas and Nebraska had revealed identical patterns of intimidation and forced consolidation, all coordinated through legal firms that provided professional distance between the criminal activity and the beneficiaries. It's a business model, Donnelly explained to Marshal Thornton. Identify valuable properties, manufacture legal justification for seizure, eliminate resistance through violence disguised as frontier justice, then consolidate ownership through legitimate business structures that hide the criminal origins. Standing Bear provided the cultural perspective that revealed how the conspiracy manipulated racial tensions to achieve economic goals. They use fear of Indian raids to justify federal intervention, then arrange false attacks that provide evidence supporting their claims. My people become scapegoats for violence we didn't commit, while the real criminals hide behind the chaos they've created. Thornton's investigation expanded over the following days as he interviewed Alliance families, examined physical evidence, and verified their claims against federal records he'd brought from the territorial capital. His thoroughness was both encouraging and sobering. Encouraging because it confirmed the legitimacy of his investigation. Sobering because it revealed how extensively corruption had penetrated territorial governance. But it was the arrival of Thornton's partner that truly demonstrated the federal government's commitment to addressing the situation they'd exposed. Deputy Marshal Sarah Mitchell rode into their settlement with the kind of professional competence that immediately established her credentials as a serious law enforcement officer rather than another political appointee. Marshal Mitchell, Thornton said by way of introduction, specializes in financial crimes and interstate criminal enterprises. She's been investigating similar activities in Colorado and Kansas. Mitchell's first observation revealed the sophistication of her approach to complex criminal investigations. The financial patterns you've documented here match activities we've been tracking across 4 territories. Someone has been implementing identical strategies on a massive scale. Her examination of their evidence focused on details that revealed the economic scope of what they were confronting. Land values, resource development rights, transportation infrastructure, and market manipulation, all coordinated through a network of legitimate businesses that concealed systematic criminal activity. The total value of properties affected by these operations exceeds anything we've seen in territorial criminal investigations, Mitchell announced after completing her financial analysis. We're looking at millions of dollars in stolen land and resources affecting hundreds of families across multiple territories. Rebecca Reynolds, now 13 and increasingly involved in the Alliance's documentation efforts, asked the question that revealed her precocious understanding of the political implications of their situation. Marshall Mitchell, if this criminal organization is so large and powerful, how do you plan to prosecute them without being stopped by the officials they've corrupted? Mitchell's answer demonstrated the federal government's recognition that territorial corruption required federal solutions. Rebecca, we've been building cases simultaneously across multiple territories, coordinating with federal prosecutors who operate beyond local political influence. When we move against this organization, it will be comprehensive and coordinated. Thornton added crucial information about the federal strategy for addressing territorial corruption. The President has authorized special federal jurisdiction for investigating organized criminal enterprises that operate across territorial boundaries. We have the authority to bypass local officials who've been compromised. But it was Standing Bear who identified the tactical challenge that would determine whether federal prosecution could succeed against such a sophisticated criminal organization. Marshall Thornton, these criminals have been very careful to maintain legal distance from their violent activities. How do you prove that legitimate businessmen ordered assassinations when they used intermediaries and false documentation? Thornton's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who'd been preparing for exactly this question. Mrs. Morrison, that's where your evidence becomes crucial. The captured attacker you interrogated has agreed to provide federal testimony in exchange for protection from retaliation. His information, combined with your documentation, provides the direct connection between legitimate business operations and criminal violence. The federal investigation that followed was unlike anything the territory had ever witnessed. Teams of federal agents, prosecutors, and investigators descended on the region with the authority and resources to conduct comprehensive examination of criminal activities that had operated with impunity for years. More importantly, the investigation was coordinated with similar operations in other territories, creating a federal response that was too large and comprehensive for local corruption to defeat through intimidation or legal manipulation. Martha Reynolds found herself working directly with federal prosecutors to organize evidence that would support prosecutions spanning multiple territories. Her skills at research and documentation proved invaluable for organizing complex cases that involved hundreds of individual crimes, coordinated through sophisticated criminal structures. Samuel Reynolds, now 16 and experienced in both cattle management and defensive tactics, was recruited as a federal scout to guide investigators to locations where evidence of criminal activity might be found. His knowledge of the territory and his experience with the Alliance's communication systems made him invaluable for coordinating complex operations across vast distances. But it was the transformation of their settlement that truly demonstrated how far they'd come from their desperate beginning. What had started as punishment land worked by outcasts and refugees had become the operational headquarters for the largest federal criminal investigation in territorial history. Their well-provided water for federal teams, their facilities housed investigators and prosecutors, and their Alliance family served as witnesses whose testimony would expose corruption that had threatened every independent settler in the region. Standing Bear served as cultural liaison, helping federal investigators understand how racial manipulation had been used to conceal criminal activity while ensuring that federal prosecutions didn't create additional injustice for Indian communities that had been falsely blamed for violence they hadn't committed. Morrison found himself coordinating security for federal operations, using the defensive network they'd built to protect their alliance to safeguard federal investigators who were documenting evidence that would bring down Hancock's entire criminal enterprise. The empire they'd built on worthless land had become something neither of them had ever imagined, the foundation for federal justice that would transform the entire territory from a haven for organized crime into a place where honest people could build legitimate prosperity. But even as federal investigators gathered overwhelming evidence of criminal conspiracy, everyone involved understood that the most dangerous phase of their war was just beginning. Desperate criminals with vast resources and nothing left to lose would not surrender without attempting one final, devastating attack. The final battle between justice and corruption was about to begin, and its outcome would determine whether their empire of cooperation would survive to become a model for frontier development, or whether it would be destroyed by enemies who preferred chaos to accountability. The final confrontation came not with violence, but with something William Hancock feared far more than bullets: the power of legitimate authority backed by irrefutable evidence. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Morrison and Standing Bear had been forced into marriage as punishment, federal marshals arrived at Hancock's mansion with arrest warrants that would dismantle his criminal empire forever. Standing Bear watched the arrests from the porch of their original shelter, now expanded into the main house of what had become the Morrison Alliance Ranch. In her arms, she held their 3-month-old daughter, Hope, whose birth had symbolized their transformation from victims to victors in ways that went far beyond personal triumph. "It's finished," Marshal Thornton announced as he returned from Amarillo with news of the coordinated arrests that had taken place across 4 territories. Simultaneously, Hancock, McReady, and 17 associates are in federal custody. The financial records we seized will lead to additional arrests, but the main criminal organization has been eliminated. Morrison stood beside his wife, his massive frame no longer carrying the defeated posture of a man who'd lost everything. Instead, he possessed the confident bearing of someone who'd built something meaningful from nothing. Someone whose vision had created prosperity where others had seen only wasteland. "What happens to all the land Hancock stole?" Martha Reynolds asked. She'd been appointed as Territorial Land Commissioner, her expertise in legal research making her invaluable for sorting out the complex property disputes that Hancock's criminal activities had created. Marshal Mitchell, who'd remained to oversee the restoration of stolen properties, unrolled maps that showed the true scope of what their victory had accomplished. Over 300 families will have their property restored. Land seizures based on fraudulent legal claims will be reversed, and the federal government will compensate victims who lost property through manufactured debt obligations. But it was the economic transformation of their region that truly demonstrated the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. With Hancock's monopolistic control eliminated, independent ranchers and farmers were free to develop their properties without fear of legal manipulation or violent retaliation. The Morrison Alliance Ranch had become the model for cooperative development that federal authorities were promoting throughout the territorial system. Their techniques for alkali soil improvement, water resource management, and collaborative ranching were being studied by agricultural specialists from Washington. Carlos Mendoza had expanded his operation to include over 800 head of cattle, using breeding techniques developed through their alliance to produce stock specifically adapted to harsh frontier conditions. His success had attracted contracts from military suppliers who needed reliable sources of beef for frontier garrisons. Frank Donnelly's innovations in cattle, transportation and market coordination had created the first independent shipping cooperative in the territory, allowing small ranchers to access distant markets without depending on monopolistic distribution networks. His Irish heritage and Mexican partnerships had created cultural bridges that enriched the entire region. The Reynolds family had become the territorial authority on land records and legal documentation, with Samuel Reynolds serving as deputy territorial surveyor and Rebecca Reynolds preparing to attend law school in Austin, the first woman from their county to receive such an opportunity. But perhaps the most significant transformation had occurred in Standing Bear herself. The Comanche woman who'd been handed to Morrison as punishment had become a respected leader whose influence extended far beyond their ranch boundaries. "The president wants to meet with you," Marshal Thornton announced, producing an official letter bearing federal seals that commanded respect throughout the territory. Your success in developing cooperative alliances and exposing territorial corruption has attracted attention at the highest levels of government. Standing Bear studied the invitation with the same careful attention she'd once given to reading weather signs and tracking hostile movements. But instead of planning survival strategies, she was now considering how to expand their model of cooperative development to benefit other regions struggling with similar challenges. "What does the president want to discuss?" she asked. Thornton's answer revealed the national implications of what they'd accomplished in their corner of Texas. "Federal policy for territorial development. Mrs. Morrison, your alliance structure has proven more effective at promoting sustainable settlement than traditional approaches that pit individual settlers against each other for limited resources." Morrison felt pride swelling in his chest as he understood the recognition being offered to his wife. The woman who'd been given to him as a burden had become a leader whose vision was being sought by the federal government to guide national policy. But Standing Bear's response demonstrated the wisdom that had made their success possible. "I'll consider the president's invitation, Marshal Thornton. But my first responsibility is to the families who trusted our vision when it seemed impossible. Success means nothing if we abandon the people who made it possible." Her commitment to their alliance families reflected the values that had transformed punishment land into an empire built on cooperation rather than conquest. Every decision was evaluated based on its impact on the community they'd built together, rather than on individual advancement or recognition. The celebration that evening brought together families from across their expanded alliance territory. Over 200 people gathered around bonfires that illuminated faces representing every culture and background that had found opportunity in their cooperative model. Mexican vaqueros shared songs with Irish immigrants while German farmers compared techniques with former Confederate soldiers. Children played games that combined traditions from different cultures, creating something new that belonged to the frontier rather than to any single heritage. Standing Bear addressed the assembled families with words that would be remembered and repeated across the territory for generations to come. "1 year ago, we were strangers brought together by desperation and shared enemies. Tonight, we are family united by shared prosperity and mutual respect." Morrison watched his wife speak with the authority of someone whose vision had proven itself through results rather than rhetoric. The giant who'd been defeated by legal manipulation had learned that true strength came from building alliances rather than facing challenges alone. "We've proven that cooperation can accomplish what individual effort cannot," Standing Bear continued. "We've shown that people from different backgrounds can work together for mutual benefit. Most importantly, we've demonstrated that justice is possible when honest people organize to challenge corruption." Their daughter Hope stirred in Morrison's arms, her small movements reminding him of the future they were building for children who would grow up in a world where cooperation was valued over conquest, where different cultures enriched each other. Rather than fighting for dominance, the empire they'd built wasn't measured in acres owned or wealth accumulated, but in families thriving, children educated, and communities strengthened by mutual support. Their success had created a model that was spreading across the territorial system, challenging the assumption that frontier development required ruthless competition and individual isolation. Carlos Mendoza stood to address the gathering, his voice carrying the respect that came from shared struggle and shared triumph. "Senator Morrison, Senora Standing Bear, you gave us more than opportunity. You gave us hope that honest work could build honest prosperity." Martha Reynolds added her own tribute to the couple whose forced marriage had become the foundation for regional transformation. "You showed us that seeming defeat could become victory if we had the courage to work together instead of surrendering separately." But it was young Rebecca Reynolds who expressed the sentiment that captured the true meaning of their accomplishment. "You taught us that being different makes us stronger, not weaker, that helping each other helps everyone, that building something together creates more than any of us could build alone." As the evening progressed and families shared stories of their individual journeys from desperation to prosperity, Morrison reflected on the transformation that had occurred in his own life. The broken giant who'd knelt in chains had become a leader whose vision was being studied by federal authorities as a model for national development. Standing Bear had evolved from a punishment bride into Coty as a model for national development, a respected figure whose influence extended far beyond ranching and agriculture. Her understanding of cooperative development was being sought by territorial governments struggling to promote sustainable settlement. Their worthless alkali flats had become productive ranchland that supported hundreds of families while serving as headquarters for the largest criminal investigation in territorial history. Their forced marriage had become a partnership that demonstrated how different cultures could enrich each other through mutual respect and shared purpose. Most importantly, their punishment had become their triumph. What Hancock had intended as their destruction had become the foundation for his own downfall and the transformation of an entire region from a haven for criminal exploitation into a model of cooperative prosperity. Standing Bear joined Morrison on their porch as the celebration continued around their fires, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. The stars above looked down on an empire built not through conquest, but through the radical idea that people could accomplish more by helping each other than by competing against each other. Do you think we'll accept the president's invitation? Morrison asked. Standing Bear's answer reflected the wisdom that had guided every decision in their remarkable journey. We'll do whatever serves our people best. Individual recognition matters less than continuing the work we started here. Their empire would continue growing, not through territorial expansion, but through the spread of their cooperative model to other regions where honest people struggled against corrupt systems. Their story would inspire families across the frontier to believe that cooperation could triumph over exploitation, that justice was possible even in the most challenging circumstances. The giant and the Comanche woman who'd been forced together as punishment had created something that neither Hancock nor anyone else had ever imagined: proof that love, respect, and mutual support could build empires more lasting than any founded on fear and greed. Their punishment land had become the foundation of a legacy that would influence frontier development for generations. Their forced marriage had become a partnership that demonstrated the power of unity across cultural differences. Most importantly, their story had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from transforming the conditions that create enemies in the first place. The empire they'd built together would endure because it was founded on principles that made everyone stronger rather than making some people powerful at the expense of others. Under the vast Texas sky, surrounded by families whose prosperity they'd helped create, Morrison and Standing Bear Morrison continued building the future they'd envisioned when everyone else saw only worthless land and impossible circumstances. Their empire rose not through conquest, but through the revolutionary idea that true strength comes from helping others find their own. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.